Kia ora. Welcome to you all for coming along, and thank you for joining us for the first ever online education series for community strength and balance leaders. This is a partnership between Live Stronger for Longer, ACC and Sport Taranaki. My name's Hilary and I am the Strength and Balance Coordinator for Sport Taranaki. So we'll kick off with a karakia and then we'll introduce the series and our wonderful speaker this afternoon, and enjoy. This will be recorded, so if you have to duck out or want to catch up later or rewatch it, it will be available. We'll send you out a link. Whaia, te tika, whaia te pono, whaia te aroha. Mō te oranga tangata, kia puta, ki te whaiau. Ki te ao marama, humie, puie, taikie. Cool. So if you have any questions today, just pop them in the chat, write them in the chat, and then at the end of the session, I will ask Johanna those questions, and we'll go from there. The aim of today's series is to provide you, our community strength and balance instructors across New Zealand, to just give you some information and to allow you to hear from expert speakers that we can't always have in our regions. Hopefully this will increase your understanding of older adults' health and to help support you in supporting your participants in your classes each week as well. As I said, it is going to be recorded, so you will be able to catch up with any of this or rewatch it at any point. So I'd just like to welcome our wonderful first speaker today, Johanna O'Leary, who is a physiotherapist and memory team clinician. She's based in Auckland, and so some people have already had the pleasure of listening to Johanna sharing her information and her experience and knowledge, and she comes very highly recommended, so we're very lucky to have her today. Jo is a physiotherapist, memory team clinician. Her clinical background is in physiotherapy, where she specialised in older adult health and neurological rehabilitation, working in both inpatient and community settings. This sparked for her an interest in cognition and cognitive impairment, and she has a specific passion for maximising brain health and preventing dementia, which is something that many of us are passionate about. Jo's been part of the Counties Manukau Health Te Kahu Mahara memory team for 7 years, and I'd love to welcome her and thank her for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for that, Hilary. Appreciate it, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you guys all today and to share knowledge and some tips and tricks. Really, it's a really important message that isn't talked about as much, and so we often think about exercise being good for our physical health, but actually what's not talked about very often is the positive effects that exercise has on our brain's health. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, and it really is a privilege to be able to do that. So let's get started. Right, so looking at what we're going to cover during this session, so we're going to set the scene, so talking about what cognition is and cognitive impairment, have a bit of context to the rest of the presentation. We'll then look at discussing the relationship, the positive relationship between exercise and cognition, and review the current exercise recommendations and guidelines. We'll highlight the potential challenges that someone with a cognitive impairment might have in a group class and look at ways to support them with that. So, like I say, a good starting point is having a bit of a look at the term cognition and cognitive impairment. So it's not an exhaustive list, but what the picture on the left is hoping to portray is that there's many parts, what we call cognitive domains, that make up our cognition. And so for me, cognition is one of these lovely umbrella terms that we love to use in medical world. And it's looking at all of these cognitive domains and how they interact with each other and how they work together, to allow us to build our knowledge, to learn, to organize ourselves, to sequence a task, to remember things, to communicate, to process some information, to understand what's being said, what we're hearing, what we're smelling, what we're tasting, and basically complete every task that we need to do in our lifetime. And when we discuss cognitive impairment or dementia, the cognitive domain that's most talked about is memory. And it's key to point out that memory is just one part of a very complex process. And so the picture on the right is a commonly used cognitive hierarchy diagram, and it goes from the bottom up. And you can see that there are other domains below memory, and so they will affect somebody's ability to remember. So for example, if someone can't concentrate or attend to the task, they're not going to retain the information that they're told. And therefore, it's really important that when we're talking about cognition, is that we're kind of zooming out from memory, because there's lots of other factors that can affect memory. And similarly, memory can affect lots of other parts of our cognition. So yeah, it's a lot more than memory. So if we move on then to cognitive impairment, so that's another big broad umbrella term, essentially describing when an individual's cognition isn't working as well as it used to. And that is for a particular reason. So it could be a side effect of a medication. It could be a stroke. Someone could have dementia. They might have a delirium. They could have a brain injury. Might have depression or anxiety, experiencing stresses. It could be substance use. It could be other neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's disease. So many different potential causes. And so it's useful to think as cognitive impairment as a symptom rather than a diagnosis. So it's a cognitive impairment secondary to or because of something. And it can be useful to think about a cognitive impairment on a continuum. So starting with the aging brain. So as we get older, our brain slows down like the rest of us. And so people can notice that they might begin to get a bit forgetful, forget maybe where they put the car keys. It can take a bit longer to remember things, but it pops back pretty quickly still. Might take them longer to do things or organize themselves, but it's very mild. Might forget the odd word. It's very mild, it's very easy to manage, and that is completely normal. Our brain naturally shrinks as we get older, so that's completely normal. The next step would be something that we call a subjective cognitive impairment. So that's where an individual is aware of the changes to their cognition a little bit more, but when they were to, if we were to test them and do any further assessments, they would score within what they classify as your normal range for that individual's age, gender, ethnicity, and educational level. And it's not affecting what they're doing day to day. It's still very, very mild. Next on from that is something that we call a mild cognitive impairment, and that's where the changes are becoming more noticeable. It's happening more frequently. There's been this progression, and friends and family are probably starting to notice things. But even though it's noticeable, what's really important to know is that it's not affecting someone's day-to-day function. It's not affecting how they do any of their daily tasks. And there's many reasons that people can experience both a subjective cognitive impairment and a mild cognitive impairment. And we've listed some of those just before. And some of those causes are reversible. So when we treat that, you'll actually find that there's some improvement. You're going back up this way. Some people find that, depending on what the reason is, it just stays the same. It doesn't progress, it doesn't get better. It just is what we call a stable cognitive impairment. And it can stay stable for a very, very, very long time. Some people will continue to progress down the continuum to the next stage, which is dementia. And so for a diagnosis of dementia, essentially there needs to be evidence of a progressive decline in an individual's cognition, and that affects their daily ability to do, their ability to do daily tasks. Now, there's over 100 different types of dementia. The most common is Alzheimer's. That accounts for about 50% of all diagnoses. And it's important to know what the specific type or the etiology is, because they do all progress and present differently. So that's a whistle-stop tour of cognition and cognitive impairment, just to provide some context. So what we're going to do now is look at the relationship between exercise or physical activity and our cognition. So there is a really good and, more importantly, growing body of evidence which highlights the benefits that regular exercise or physical activity has on our cognition. And significantly, this positive relationship is throughout our lifespan, and irrespective of whether we have a cognitive impairment or not. And that is really important. I'm going to touch on why it has such a positive effect shortly. But firstly, I just want to highlight what the positive relationships are. And we're going to start with prevention. So physical activity is being seen as a real key dementia prevention tool, and is being categorized as a protective lifestyle factor. And so there's lots of longitudinal studies, so studies that follow people over a long period of time. I mean, one's like 44 years. I'm not sure people realized that when they were signing up, but anyway, that's a long time. But anyway, so they follow people over that amount of time, and that's showing that if we're participating in regular active exercise in midlife, then we can reduce our individual risk of dementia by 30 to 45%. That's really significant. One study, in fact, has shown that if we're doing high rates of cardiovascular fitness, high intensity over long periods of time, you can actually reduce your risk by 88%. Not only can you reduce your risk, but for people that do develop dementia later, it's shown to delay its onset, so prolong the start of dementia. And so that's really important. A lot of the research is about midlife, and rightly so, or early, what we should be doing early, and rightly so. But there's also a proven preventative relationship in our older adult age group, so over 65s. And so it's thought that older adults who meet the recommended guidelines are said to have a 20% reduced risk for cognitive decline and dementia. So that's really significant. And so why is physical activity seen as such a key tool? Well, it's strongly linked to the modifiable risk factors for dementia. So this picture on the left-hand side is a lifespan model that has been created by the Lancet Commission that highlights the 12 known modifiable risk factors for dementia. And you can see that physical inactivity has its own risk, is its own risk factor, but that physical inactivity is actually linked to a lot of the other risk factors as well, such as hypertension, obesity, depression, social isolation, diabetes. And so that's why it's being seen as such a key protective lifestyle factor. What's also really good about this model is it's showing, like I say, it's a lifespan model. So it's showing the fact that we often associate dementia with older adults, but this is showing us the fact that our risk it starts early life and continues to progress. But we do need to be mindful of our older adult population, because we know that, especially after we retire, there is a link between a sedentary lifestyle and our older population. So that has an increased risk for our cognitive outcomes as well as our physical outcomes as well. Just a side note, with these risk factors, if we were to eliminate all of them, we would decrease the incidence of dementia by 40%. So if we can improve these for everybody, that we would, yeah, like I say, reduce dementia by 40%. So physical, like I say, exercise is being seen as a real key tool to kind of achieving that. Yeah, so if we go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier on, not only is there evidence to suggest that physical activity is key for prevention, but it also has a positive effect on our cognition at any age. Sorry, on our cognition at any age, irrespective of whether there's an impairment or not. And it's really the latter part of that statement that's so, so important. And so if we focus on our older adults, we know there's a body of research that shows us that if we're looking at that aging brain side of things, that if older adults are engaging in regular exercise, they are reducing their risk. So it's helping towards prevention of cognitive decline in later life, and that there are improvements being seen globally with their cognition. So a lot of the cognitive domains. When it comes to sort of subjective and mild cognitive impairment, especially the mild cognitive impairment, there's a body of research that is showing us that, again, engaging in regular exercise, you're having some improvements in cognition. And more importantly, it's reducing the risk of converting to dementia, so going further down the continuum. And that's why it's for that patient population is again being seen as a protective factor. But even for people who have dementia, though there's no consistent evidence, so there is some evidence, but it's not a consistent evidence to show an improvement in cognition significantly. The evidence does show that the positive effect is comparable to the medication that we are able to offer for people with dementia. It does depend on the type, but the majority of the time we can offer a medication called donepezil. And the role of donepezil is to slow down progression. So what evidence is showing us and research is showing us is that exercise has exactly that same effect. So even though you have dementia, it slows that progression. And there's a real positive relationship between donepezil and exercising as part of a management plan. But on top of that, the real evidence for dementia patients with exercise and the benefits are around their physical function. And that's so important because it helps them maintain independence, self-esteem, it helps mood, sleep, behavior, and it gives them an opportunity to socialize, it reduces carer stress. So there's so many benefits, even if it's not necessarily improving your cognition. So I guess the question is why it has a positive effect on our cognition. And that comes down to it being all about our neurons, our pathways, and blood flow. So briefly, just to provide some context, a message in our brain is sent via a neuron, and that's our picture here on the left-hand side. So essentially the message goes in through the top and out through the bottom to the next neuron. So like links of a chain. And those neurons links create a pathway, which is that picture on the right. So we have lots of neuronal pathways in our brains that carry messages all over the brain. And so that's just providing a bit of context for our next slide, because exercise helps maintain our old neurons and our old pathways, but it promotes making new neurons and new pathways, something we call neurogenesis. And that is so important, because if a neuron isn't working as well as it used to, or a pathway isn't working as well as it used to, we have this big old reserve bench, what we call our cognitive reserve, that can just come on in and take over that particular pathway or neuron's role. And so that means that our brain can keep working at a good, seamlessly at a good level. Not only do we help keep our old neurons and pathways healthy and make new ones, but it also helps. We have it causes increased levels of protein that enables our communication between the neurons. This is really important because we know that with Alzheimer's disease, we find what are called toxic proteins in the brain. So the more good protein we have, the better. We also know that by exercising, we can increase the volume and the size of our hippocampus and our prefrontal cortex. So those two parts of the brain are often affected in many of the types of dementia, and they are involved in memory and learning. So until not recently, by research standards, it was thought that once a particular part of your brain had a reduced volume, that was it. You weren't able to build that up. But they've since found out that that's not the case, and especially in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. There is, we might see some increase and have it in other areas like a global effect, but these are really two key areas. So that's good, really important to know. We also know that we can get improved volume and connectivity of our white and grey matter. So our white matter is responsible for communication within our brain, so everything communicating well with each other. And our grey matter is responsible for processing information. So the more we have of that, the better. And we also know that we get improved blood flow to our brain. So that's because when we're exercising, we've got that increased heart rate. And so with the increased blood flow to the brain comes more oxygen and more glucose and nutrients that the brain needs to work well. So if we don't have good blood flow up there, the brain literally can't work as well. It doesn't have its energy source. So the more of that we have, the better. We also know that we release these neurotrophic factors. So in particular is this one called BDNF, which some people might have heard about. It was in the news a few months ago. That stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's really important to make sure our neurons survive and grow. And that's really essential, again, for learning and memory. And finally, we also, when we exercise, our brains also secrete neurotransmitters, and they help with our attention. They help manage anxiety and mood, as well as helping with our memory. So essentially, we make new pathways, we keep our old ones healthy, we improve our blood flow into the brain, and that helps or enhances our opportunity to learn, maintain our cognitive function, as well as building and maintaining our cognitive reserve as well. So all of that is happening while we're exercising, and we're none the wiser. So then the next question is, what are the guidelines around physical activity to improve our cognitive outcomes? And as with most areas of research, this is the one that's really key, and this is the one that's still being developed. So what we know is that for older adults where there's no evidence of a cognitive impairment, you're wanting to participate in aerobic and/or strength training. We're looking at a moderate intensity, ideally, so 60 to 80% of your maximal heart rate percentage. And there's a real promising body of evidence for dance and for mind-body exercises, so yoga, Tai Chi, might be some Pilates, don't quote me on Pilates, but definitely yoga and Tai Chi. So that's an area that's being developed, which is really important, we'll touch on why that's quite key in a second. Anyway, for people with mild cognitive impairment, we know that aerobic activity is currently the best type of exercise we can be recommending, but there's again promising evidence for strength and for mind-body exercises as well. For people with dementia, there's a felt that a focus on balance exercises is good because there is an increased falls risk as the disease progresses. And so that's why there's a good focus on balance exercises. And there's some evidence coming out about swimming or kind of water-based activities, with the thought that the sensation of water can be calming and quite soothing. So yeah, so they're sort of the bodies of evidence that we know about. but that's the next stage, I guess. So because of that, we really are looking towards general guidelines for older adults. And so with them, you're looking at about 150 minutes a week of exercise, of moderate aerobic exercise. And so that's about 30-ish minutes a day. And that can be broken up into shorter sessions. You're also looking at doing some progressive strength training 2 days a week, balance exercises as well. Again, that relates to falls risk. But despite the recommendations, what's really key is the fact that the risk of recommending physical activity is low. So even if somebody can't manage moderate intensity, the benefits you have in terms of the process and the positive effect and relationship between exercise and cognition is the same. It's just not to the same intensity or degree. And so it will still contribute to improve functional ability and activity, irrespective of where you sit on that continuum as well. The other thing that's important just to point out and consider is about what works best for the individual, though. How would they like to participate in activity and exercise? Because everybody's different, and there are pros and cons to individual programs, one-on-one sessions and group sessions. So a huge pro obviously is an opportunity for socialization. But for some people, if they are finding it hard to follow the class, then a group situation wouldn't work for them. So it's really about what is best for the individual. Just touching as well on some future areas of research. Some of these are up and running. The key one really is knowing and having more specifics about duration, frequency, intensity. That's the real one that's going to be so key and probably change how we look at exercise prescription. But there's two others just to touch on. So there is a body of research that's looking at just aerobic activity versus multimodal, so aerobic and strength training within the same session, because we know that both are have a positive effect. So is doing them individually versus doing them as a combined, do you get more gains with the combined approach is the question. The comparison isn't available yet, but it'll be interesting to see what that brings. The other one to touch on is about this sort of combined therapy. So we know that physical activity is good for the brain. We also know that cognitive stimulation is good for the brain. So there is a body of work that's been growing to see whether if we combine the two into one session, does that have the same or similar effect to if we're doing them separately? So that could be dual tasking, or it could be doing a physical activity and then stopping and doing a cognitive activity. And so at the moment, there's no necessarily increased benefit if you do them together versus separately, but there is an acknowledgement that it just might work better for people because it can be more practical to do it both at the same time. It could be more feasible for people. It might be more efficient and effective for some people. So that's an interesting body of work that's out there as well. And what's interesting as well is the benefits were across all the cognitive domains on the whole. The last point just to touch on as well, though, is that we really need to be considering and planning for long-term exercise participation. So if we're thinking about our cardiorespiratory fitness for older adults, you generally get some sort of sufficient improvements at sort of 16 to 20 weeks on the whole. Cognitively, we're a bit longer. We're looking at 6 to 12 months, so significantly longer. And so we do need that sort of consideration as well. People aren't going to sort of feel, improvement straight away. We're in for the long haul, really. Yeah. So that's a lot of information, but hopefully it's highlighted that positive relationship between cognition and exercise, and really highlighting the need for that message to be promoted. I thought I'd just give us a little break, because that's like I say, a lot of information before we move into that next section around potential challenges and how we can support people with cognitive impairment, things you might observe and what have you. I say potential challenges because we shouldn't assume that that's the case. We shouldn't assume that because somebody has a cognitive impairment, irrespective of where they are in the spectrum, on that continuum, sorry, that they are going to. But I think it's just good to touch on what people might experience and then what we can do. So, part 2. So, what you might find is that it can take people with a cognitive impairment a bit longer to process or follow what's being said or follow what's being demonstrated. And that can mean that it might take them a bit longer to learn and that they might need a bit more feedback. So you might notice that people are just a bit slower, slightly out of sync with what's happening, or there's a slight delay. You might also find that they aren't able to recall an exercise that they might have done previously. Insight is a real key thing to highlight with for people with cognitive impairment. So and it's important for 2 reasons. First of all, someone can have reduced insight, and that can cause a lot of frustration and anxiety and tendency to withdraw, because they genuinely don't understand why they're finding things difficult. They just don't have that insight into the fact that their cognition in their brain isn't working as well as it used to. On the flip side of that, some people with cognitive impairment do have that insight, and that in itself causes frustration, anxiety, and ultimately an increased likelihood of withdrawing. So that's a real key, can be a key barrier for people for ongoing participation. It can also be harder for people to express what they want to say. So if they find something hard, or they're experiencing pain, or generally how they are, what they've been up to, it might be an environment that's just a little harder for them to express that, or they don't want to engage in a back and forth conversation because they find that difficult. So they'll just kind of say, yeah, everything's great, everything's fine. But actually that might not be the case. There can be reduced orientation to time as well. There's a lot of comparing ourselves to others. So again, if we have that insight, you're aware that you're not able to do things as well. Well, either spectrum of insight. So you're aware that you can't do it as well. And like I say, that can cause frustration and withdrawal. But it also is very common for people with mild cognitive impairment and dementia to have reduced self-confidence and self-identity and increased stress. There's a lot of connection between mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and mood. And so that's low mood, stress, and anxiety. So that's really important to be mindful of as well. And so because they're aware and comparing or don't understand why, again, less likely to keep going. And as a result, it's not uncommon for people with cognitive impairment to be the ones hanging back, or choosing to be back at the back of the class. On top of all of that as well, there are some barriers or logistics. And these aren't exclusive to older adults, and they're not or with cognitive impairment. But in terms of access or reduced access to the community, it is more prevalent, given that individuals with cognitive impairment are less likely to be driving. So that can be a barrier to participation. And obviously affordability is a barrier to many people at all ages, with or without cognitive impairment. But it's important to highlight that despite the potential challenges for people with cognitive impairment participating in groups, there is no increase in risk or adverse event, and participation can obviously be done very safely. And I only highlight that because it is very common for assumptions and there to be stigma. So I think it's important to highlight that, because it does limit opportunities for this patient population. We very often find that even a suggestion of cognitive impairment mean that referrals to lots of different services are either harder or don't get accepted. So it is something that is out there, and so just wanted to touch on that. But what's really key is that as health professionals or providers is that we're flexible, so we can identify the potential problems for people with cognitive impairment, and then being flexible about how we provide that service. And so a couple of things just to think about and sort of practice, I guess. Looking at creating a comfortable environment. So having a safe environment is very important for people with cognitive impairment, especially mild cognitive impairment, and even more so people with dementia. It's really important. So they might need more interpersonal support, might need more supervision or some more encouragement. It might be reduced number of people in that class. It might be having classes with more people with cognitive impairment in those classes. It could be reduced noises, thinking of the environment itself. There is a lot of information and research about dementia design in terms of spaces that's really quite interesting, and those environmental factors definitely do increase cognitive stress, which I'll talk about in a second. It's also then we're going to touch on communication, verbal and non-verbal, in a second. So looking at alternatives or variations of exercises, so tailoring things more towards that individual to adjust for the cognitive impairment. And I think it's important about how that is approached. So checking in with them at the end of the session, see what they've found easy or difficult. Or you can provide alternatives as you go, sort of be next to the person so you're doing it with them so that they're feeling supportive. The key is essentially no suggestion that anybody would, but not highlighting it in front of other people. And the other key is the fact that it's about it being an individual process. And so everybody is different, and there might be a need for a bit of a trial and error process and some flexibility as well. Providing written handouts or other media forms in between sessions so that there can be some repetition, some practice, or they have something to refer to, and so that they feel a bit more comfortable for the next session. Importance of messaging with lots of positivity, focusing on participation, not ability. Human nature is to focus on the result and how well we did, but it's about the fact that we're doing something rather than nothing, and it's still helping, you know, so let's keep going. Lots of positivity around that. The not highlighting or correcting things we'll touch on in a second when it comes to communication. Also thinking about pace, so pace of the sessions, allowing for time for that increased processing and sequencing. Also considering music that you're using if that's a case in the groups. So thinking about the pace of the music and how that can relate to the pace of the exercise so that they are kind of in sync, and that might need to be a little slower at times. Having the option of a support person being there with them, again, that's creating some safety for them. It also means that if we're giving them, you know, that information afterwards, the support person's there with them so that they can go and help and practice at home as well. You might look at some text and call reminders for each session, and then also looking at providing knowledge on alternative transport options and funding. So acknowledging that this might be a bit different in different regions we often link people in with Dementia Auckland around, or age concern around the total mobility scheme, and we also have sort of St John's shuttles and other health other charitable organisations that we can link people in for transport to appointments and whatever other things that they like to do. But the key message really is about identifying what the gap is for the person, and then looking at how we can fill it for them, rather than asking them to sort of, you know, just rather than expecting them just to fit in with the system for everybody else, because it doesn't work. It won't work, and the outcome of that will be that they just, like I say, won't participate and withdraw, unfortunately. So just focusing and touching on communication. So it's such an important skill when caring for people with cognitive impairment. And that's because people with cognitive impairment often experience what we call cognitive stress. So that's where they are asked questions or put on the spot as such, and are aware that they're not able to find that answer. And when that happens, the brain has a stress response, and it's really hard for them to break that response. So what's really key is about considering your phrasing and your wording. So thinking about your wheres, your whats, your whos, your hows, they often cause that cognitive stress and put the person with cognitive impairment on the back foot immediately. Try and avoid tag questions like, do you remember, at the end of what we're saying. So essentially, you're looking at trying to provide a fact that then provides a prompt for the individual, and then that makes it quite comfortable and safe. So for example, if I was on the wards treating a patient, and I was to come in and say, you know, morning Wendy, I'm Joe, we met yesterday, do you remember when we did those exercises and then we went for a bit of a walk with the frame? You did really well, so yeah, you know, can we do that again today? From Wendy's perspective, first of all, she might not remember who I am, or she might recognize my face but can't remember my name, and she's having all of those thoughts while I'm talking to her and thinking, gosh, I should be able to remember that. It's really rude that I don't know who that person is. I don't know, do I want to do these things? And more often than not, the answer will be no, because the safe place is to stay where I am. Or they'll say yes, but actually their body language might be saying no. So instead of approaching it that way, we could go in and say, good morning, Wendy. My name's Joe. We met yesterday. We did some exercises and some mobility, some walking practice. You did really, really well, and I'd love it. You know, it would be great if we could do that again today. So I haven't asked her to remember anything. I haven't placed Wendy in any sort of cognitive stress. I've created, given her all the prompts to be able to then piece it together, and just feel a lot safer. And again, that's the key. It's looking at trying not to interrupt, even if it's taken a while for people to either connect their thoughts or get their words out. And also thinking about your tone. So we know that people, especially with dementia, have an increased sensitivity to emotional tone. So if the tone is coming across as rushed or anxious or short, and that can cause worry and distract them from actually being able to focus on what's being said. So just being mindful of that. Not correcting, even though you know you're right. Now, this is a key thing that we talk to all our whānau about, because it can cause a lot of frustration for both parties. And so very often, will experience a case of, you know, where someone with a cognitive impairment might not have remembered a piece of information, and then you would say, oh, but I told you that last time, and they would say, no, you didn't. And then you would say, yes, you did. And it just, what it causes is escalation. And at the end of the day, it's not terribly helpful, completely understandable, but not very helpful. So it's a case of knowing you were right, and that being enough. Because from the person with cognitive impairments perspective, they genuinely believe that you haven't told them that. So remember, I told you we were going to do that, you know, do you remember? You know, we were going to do that. I told you about that last week. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. No, you didn't. That's fine. Instead, it would be like, oh, did I not? Sorry, I thought I had. I apologize for that. Would you like to try this now anyway? Use of close-ended questions if you need to. So if it is, that can always work better. So instead of having a very open-ended question, something that just requires a yes or a no can sometimes be very helpful. Or giving two choices, not too many choices, but a couple of choices can be helpful as well. You providing a prompt or filling in the gap when you need to. So that's when you're finding people are struggling to, and that's sort of assisting them to get back on track, but give them obviously the opportunity to first. And take your time, allow them to respond and express what they're trying to say, and provide reassurance. If they're finding it hard or they can't remember, they don't, you know, they often apologize, and it's just providing that reassurance to know that they don't need to. It's okay. We all do this sometimes, and just, you know, really providing that reassurance. But as well as our verbal communication, our non-verbal communication is just as important, because it creates the tone of the environment. And again, we're aiming for that feeling of safety. So our facial expressions and our body language needs to match what we're saying. So if I'm saying, oh, don't worry about it, yeah, take your time, yeah, it's fine, you know, and I'm looking at my watch, or I'm not really looking at the person, or I'm sounding a little short, I guess, all of those things are being picked up on. So we need to make sure our non-verbal communication is matching what we're saying. And the same for the individual as well. So like we were saying before, very often they might just agree to things, but their body language might be saying no. So saying, oh, you know, do you want to get up and go for a bit of a walk? And they're going, yeah, but you know, they're holding onto the side of the chair with like white knuckles. Well, that body language, and you know, back like that, their body language is saying no, even though they're saying yes. So it's acknowledging that, and again, creating that feeling of safety. And finally, it's really encouraging communication. We know that people with cognitive impairment tend to withdraw from conversation, and that in itself is a skill. And therefore, if we're not practicing it, if we're not participating, you know, if you don't use it, you lose it. So they often withdraw, defer to other people, and sort of take a step back. So it's trying to, you know, encourage that. It's really important for quality of life and preserving your self-identity. So the keys really is, does it matter? No. And just like I say, allowing your communication to provide a feeling of safety. So in summary, exercise is good for your body and your mind, and that is definitely a message that we're wanting to get out there as much as we can. That positive relationship is irrespective of our age and whether there is a cognitive impairment or not. So it's really key for prevention, for delaying onset, and for slowing progression of cognitive impairment wherever we sit on that spectrum. We need more research so we can be more specific in terms of our exercise prescription. People with cognitive impairment may experience a challenge in a group, they may not. And so let's just consider how we can help support this patient population so that we can overcome that barrier to participation, and help support them as much as we can. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your time. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks so much, Jo. That was awesome. please, feel free to type any questions in the chat, and I will ask Jo those on your behalf. If you're not sure, right at the top of your bar, it will say there's a little button that says chat, little speech bubble. Feel free to write in there. I'll give them another minute. But if you do come up with questions after the session has ended, please send them through. There's an email on the page in front of you. Just preventfalls@acc.co.nz, and you'll get a response there. We can send that through to Johanna if it's relevant for her. Otherwise, someone at ACC can answer it. Oh, we do have a question. When looking at aerobic exercise, will you consider oxygen uptake in bloodstream as well as puffing?
Yeah, so essentially it is about the oxygen in the bloodstream. So as we're exercising, your heart rate is going up, so more oxygen is being pumped up to the brain. And so that with it takes the oxygen and the nutrients and the glucose and everything that they need, that the brain needs to work well, which is why you see the bigger benefits when you're doing that moderate intensity. So that's 60 to 80% maximal heart rate percentage, and even higher, than that. That's where that direct relationship comes from.
Cool. Awesome. There's someone here who teaches dance with people with cognitive impairments. Does correct a reminder for posture and breathing and improving dance style techniques, but done with humour and general comments to the group as a whole. Someone else says, no questions due to the clarity of your presentation. Thank you. You're preaching to the converted. Cool. So please send any other questions through to preventfalls@acc.co.nz. Massive thank you to you, Johanna, for sharing your session today. I guess we all know already how great exercise is, but it's so awesome to hear, how powerful it is from a brain perspective, and all those wonderful tips which, can help us make all our classes and our group sessions more inclusive to everyone. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So we will send out a recording or a link to the recording for this, as well as the slides. Next week, our session is on play for body, mind and soul. So it'll be at the same time next Monday at 1:30. I will send out the link to the lead agents in the next day. So you'll have that. So it'll have a different registration link to this week. As always, if there's any questions, my email will be on the bottom. So feel free to reach out if you've got questions. And we will just close with a karakia and wish you all well for the rest of the day. So feel free to join me if you like. Whaia, whaia, whaia te tika, whaia te pono, whaia te aroha. Mō te oranga tangata, kia puta, ki te whaiau, ki te ao marama, humie, huie, taikia. Thank you. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And any questions or feedback, please let us know. Thanks.